Rally. Wait for my call on the freeze. Freeze? 805! Now that is a lot of damage considering that normally a base Nighthawk still hunt shot hits for around 250,000. So how did we get here? Well, dear viewer, the answer is buff stacking. The final shape introduced several new buff types into the game as well as making older, lesser used ones far more accessible and easier to use. And with the nerfs to things like Well of Radiance and the sheer number of buffs and debuffs that any prismatic subclass has access to, it can become a little overwhelming to know what buffs you need and how exactly they stack in any given situation. So today, I'm going to be providing you with a detailed breakdown of the rules of buff stacking in Destiny 2, all the way from Lumina to Transcendence to healing autos and so on. So if you want to know how Still Hunt goes from this to this, then you'll want to stick around. Now for a quick word from today's video sponsor. So here we have the trailer for the brand new event. So let's see how this is. Oh, the animation is crisp, man. Ooh, there's Loki. Loki the Deceiver. Sound like fun? Then stick around and I'll tell you about the game that's become my new latest obsession. Imagine stepping into a vast realm of gods and warriors where myth meets might and the battlefields are filled with legendary champions straight out of Asgard. Today, Raid have invited me to talk about their biggest event yet, the Asgard Divide. Everyone can get the legendary champion Loki the Deceiver completely for free by simply logging into Raid for 7 days between now and October 23rd. The whole event will continue from August 21st to November 22nd. The other 3 Norse mythology champions can be earned via in-game activities which include Thor Feyhammer, Odin Feyfather, and Freya Fateweaver. As part of the Asgard Divide, players can also enter the Event Dungeon, a time-limited dungeon that sees you facing off against enemies and a boss connected to the current event. Raid has been a super fun game for me to play whenever I have downtime from making videos, and I've been having a lot of fun with my current favorite champion, the Umbral Enchantress. She's from the Demon Spawn and deals a ton of AoE damage with her awesome Undying Evil skill. I highly encourage anyone watching to give Raid a try by clicking my link in the description or scanning the QR code right here. And just by logging in for 7 days, you can get a limited edition legendary champion Loki completely for free, as well as a free starter pack with an epic boss killer Grizzled Jarl and Knight Errant upon reaching level 25. Once you're in and crushing your enemies, come find my username Lamadi2, and if you're fast enough, you can join my clan which has the same name. So just hit my link in the description and I'll see you on the battlefield. Thank you to Raid for sponsoring this video. First of all, in Destiny 2, there are essentially 4 main categories of buffs that you need to be aware of, these being empowering buffs, global debuffs, weapon surges, and unique buffs. So let's start by going through each of these categories one by one. To start with, we have empowering buffs, and the one I'm sure you're most familiar with is Well of Radiance, but there are still several others that fall under this category like Banner Shield, Empowering Rift, or Radiant to name a few. So how do they work? Empowering buffs are applied to you, the user, and only affect your outgoing weapon damage. This means that if my weapon deals 100 damage normally and I make myself Radiant, my weapon is now dealing 125 damage because Radiant is a 25% empowering buff. Using the same example, what would happen if I was Radiant but also stood in an Empowering Rift? Would my damage go up or would it stay the same? Well, as you can see here, while Radiant, my Kvostov hits for 1,863, and while I'm still Radiant and standing in an Empowering Rift, my damage is still 1,863. And the reason for that is because empowering buffs work on a highest takes priority basis. So that is to say, it doesn't matter how many empowering buffs you have currently, only the highest percentage one will take priority and be the only one applied to you. So what is the highest percentage empowering buff? It's the Titan Void Super Banner Shield sitting at a nice 40%. No other empowering buff exceeds 40% right now, that's the highest it can possibly go. The main thing to remember here is that empowering buffs only affect weapon damage and don't stack with each other, only the highest percentage takes priority. Up next we have global debuffs, and similarly I'm sure you're quite familiar with the likes of Tether or Tractor Cannon since these are the more widely used ones, though admittedly, with how easy it is for prismatic subclasses to access the weakened debuff, Tractor Cannon has greatly dipped in popularity, but we'll talk more about that later. In contrast to empowering buffs, global debuffs are effects that you apply to enemies, rather than yourself. If an enemy is debuffed, they receive more damage from any source. This can be abilities, weapons, raid relics, you name it. As long as they are under the effects of the debuff, they will always take a percentage more damage corresponding to the debuff in use. Speaking of, the highest currently available debuff tier is 30%, and there are multiple sources that provide this number such as Tractor Cannon, Tether, or Felwinter's Helm. Strangely though, in PvP, Tether and Tractor are 50% debuffs, which to me is an odd quirk but worth mentioning nonetheless. Overall, it's best to think of debuffs as split into 2 categories, the first being the higher 30% general tier that only comes from Tether, Tractor, or Felwinter's Helm, and the second being the lower 15% weakened tier that comes from exactly 2 sources. The first is the Void Weakened subclass verb that causes enemies to be affected by a 15% debuff for around 6 seconds or more depending on on how it was applied. And as of the final shape patch, there are many ways you can apply Weaken extremely easily. Twilight Axes apply it, Buried Bloodline hits while Devour is active also do, you also have Prismatic and Void Grenades, Heart Shadow, Snare Bomb, the list goes on. Just be aware that this is one of the easiest debuffs to apply since it's so readily available, which is also why despite Tractor and Tether being higher percentage debuffs, they are used far less because one forces you to use a support super and the other entirely removes your heavy slot from dealing damage. The second source of the 15% tier is the Divinity Exotic Trace Rifle from Garden of Salvation, and despite being the same percentage as Void Weaken, the Divinity Cage has no interactions with the Void sandbox whatsoever. It's entirely separate, which is why this category is split. In terms of stacking rules, most of the time, global debuffs behave the exact same as empowering buffs in that once again the highest percentage takes priority. So if I hit a target with Tractor Cannon then proceed to weaken them as well, my damage will still remain the same. I say most of the time though because there is one unique debuff that breaks this rule, but we'll talk more about that shortly in the unique buffs section. The main thing to remember here is that global debuffs affect the damage that enemies receive and they do not stack with each other. The third category of buffs is probably the easiest to understand, and that is weapon surges. Weapon surges, as you can probably tell, only affect the damage of your weapons. Weapon surges can be obtained in a multitude of ways, especially now in the final shape, but the easiest way by far is to equip affinity surge mods on your boots. You can equip up to a maximum of 3 surge mods, and each tier increases the overall buff percentage by a moderate amount as long as you're holding armor charge. 1 mod is 10%, 2 mods is 17%, and 3 mods is 22%. Weapon surges also come in a final 4th tier of 25%, but this tier is only obtainable via exotic gear through specific actions. A good example is Spirit of the Eternal Warrior on the Titan exotic class item that grants 30 seconds of super element matching tier 4 surge after casting your super, which to be honest is an absurd amount of time that will last you for the full length of most damage phases in the game, bar maybe the Witness and the War Priest. What this also does is it frees up your boot surges, which you can now delegate to a separate weapon to fully optimize surge allocation. And a good example of this would be if you wanted to use something like a Regnant with autoloading Cascade and Cloud Strike, since casting Twilight Arsenal would give you tier 4 Void Surge for 30 seconds on your Regnant, and then you could also have triple Arc Surge on your boots for Cloud Strike. There are multiple other exotics that provide tier 4 Surge like Raiju's Harness, Doomfang Pauldron, or Mantle of Battle Harmony, though specifically in a DPS context these exotics are rarely used outside of a few specific ones like Foe Tracer, Spirit of the Foe Tracer, and Spirit of the Eternal Warrior. In general, most people tend to stick to tier 3 Surge with their boot mods since it's the easiest to slap on. In exactly the same way as empowering buffs and global debuffs, weapon surges do not stack with each other and the highest percentage takes priority once again. So the main thing to remember here is that the easiest and most reliable way to get weapon surges is by equipping surge mods on your leg armor, and the highest percentage takes priority. Okay then, before we move on to the 4th and final category, you ought to know how each of the first 3 categories stack with one another, because it's different to how they stack among themselves. Empowering buffs, global debuffs, and weapon surges all stack multiplicatively with each other. This means that if I was Radiant, I had weakened an enemy, and I had tier 3 surge, I would multiply my damage, which let's just say is 100 for argument's sake, by 1.25, 1.15, and 1.22, yielding an overall 75.4% increase to my damage. All buff stacking in Destiny 2 is multiplicative. Now that you're aware of that, let's talk about the 4th category known as unique buffs. Unique buffs are very similar in nature to empowering buffs in that most of the time all they do is increase your weapon damage. However, unique buffs are unique because rather than selecting the highest percentage one to take priority, if you are under the effects of multiple unique buffs, they will instead stack multiplicatively with each other. So for example, if I had 2 separate unique buffs that are each worth 10%, my damage would increase by 21% overall, and there's really no end to this. You can carry on stacking unique buffs so long as there are more unique buffs to stack. As I mentioned just a moment ago, unique buffs are not entirely restricted to weapon damage. Some of them also increase your ability damage as well, such as the artifact perk this season Transference that increases the damage of your grenade and melee while transcendent by 10%. To name a few more examples, we have Worm Byproduct, hitting an enemy frozen by stasis, the Titan exotic glaive bubble, the healing auto no hesitation with its unique support frame boost, Argent Blade, but above all else, the one you should start getting most familiar with is Transcendence. For those of you who are unaware, being Transcendent provides a small 5% damage boost to all of your weapons, and this boost in particular does happen to be a unique buff. The best part about all of this is that unique buffs also stack multiplicatively with the other 3 categories as well. So now let's go back to that starting clip and work out exactly what's going on there. In this specific scenario, I'm standing behind a banner shield as my buff, Templar is tractored, and I have tier 3 surge from my armor charge. My teammates also hit me with no hesitation, I passed through a Titan glaive bubble, and before damage began, I hit myself with Parasite to gain Worm Byproduct, and I also activated Transcendence right as damage began. I also made sure to hit Templar while he was frozen for another 10% boost, and what do you know? 805! Now, of course, it is very unrealistic to have all of these buffs going at once in an actual damage phase, though the purpose of this clip was more of a demonstration to show you how far you can push buff stacking if you know what you're doing. That said though, if you're in a boss encounter, it makes perfect sense to save your transcendence for the damage phase, because in total it lasts for about 20 seconds, which is most of the damage phase anyway, and by doing so, you're buffing your damage by a further 5%. It also isn't entirely unrealistic to have a warlock place a stasis turret nearby that will constantly keep freezing the boss, which means any bullets that make contact while the boss is encased will be buffed by another 10%, and given how strong warlocks are for damage right now with Starry to Nova Bomb, you're bound to start noticing this more. Continuing the weirdness, there is one particular unique buff that I alluded to earlier that actually behaves like a global debuff while still retaining the rule set of a unique buff, and this is the Aeon Sect of Force mod. Sect of Force makes it so landing rapid precision hits versus a champion or mini-boss debuffs them by 20% for 30 seconds for your teammates. And on its own, it is a debuff in the traditional sense in that said champion will take 20% more damage from all sources, but if you pair this mod with Divinity, the debuff total jumps all the way up to 38%, which means that the debuff from Divinity has stacked multiplicatively with Sect of Force, meaning Sect of Force is a unique buff that behaves like a debuff. What a twist. Speaking of twists, sadly this effect doesn't work on actual bosses, it's limited to mini-bosses and champions only, and given that the whole spiel of Aeons is for them to be used in GMs, this doesn't really surprise me. Lastly in this section, I quickly want to highlight the Prismatic Fragment Facet of Courage, which increases the damage of your light abilities by 10% provided the enemy is debuffed by a darkness debuff, and the easiest by far is Unravel since it never falls off. Facet of Courage is a unique buff and is particularly handy when paired with Golden Gun or any of the other high damage light supers like Twilight Arsenal or Nova Bomb, so just something to consider when fighting your next boss. Before we end off, I also want to quickly touch on some misconceptions and miscellaneous stuff that I've seen concerning buff stacking, the first of which is Lumina. Lumina crops up a lot when talking about buff stacking since it seems like a lot of people believe it's a unique buff and stacks with everything, though this actually isn't the case. The Blessing of the Sky buff provided by Lumina is in fact an empowering buff and behaves as such. It is one of the highest available empowering buffs, sitting at 35% that also lasts for 11 seconds, though it does not stack with other empowering buffs like Well or Radiance. They are all one and the same. Second, there is such a thing as the 20% Debuff Family, but this only exists in two specific cases. The first of which is the Flash Counter Sword perk, and the second the Enhanced Scanner Augment Raid mod from Deepstone Crypt that applies a 20% debuff to marked targets. Rather strange, but I thought they were both worth mentioning anyway. Finally, the debuffs provided by Tractor Cannon and Felwinter's Helm specifically are actually able to have their durations refreshed by applying Void Weaken to the target, which just means that if you build around this mechanic properly, you can make your 30% debuffs last significantly longer, and I actually have a video discussing how to best take advantage of this if you're curious. This won't work on Tether though, so just bear that in mind. So overall, when it comes to buff stacking in Destiny 2, you ought to be aware of a few main things. 1. You need to have access to at least an empowering buff like Radiant, a global debuff like Weaken, and weapon surges from your boots. This alone is enough to efficiently carry you through most boss encounters in the game, though if you wanted to take things a step further, you should also take advantage of the two unique buffs of Transcendence and Facet of Courage whenever you can, since there's really no reason not to. I hope this video has managed to educate you on the ins and outs of buff stacking in Destiny 2, though if you still want to learn more, I've left a link in the description to a really handy spreadsheet made by Court Projects that covers what I've talked about in far more detail, so give it a look if you're curious. Anyway, that's all I've got for today. I'll see you in the next one. If you made it this far, thank you so much. Your support means the world. And if you're really into the content I create, consider becoming a member of the channel, which not only lets you support me in the best way possible, it also nets you a whole host of awesome perks along with it. A massive shout out to these members up on screen, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye for now, dear viewer.